He opened the old barn door, never expecting to find a car that history had worked overtime to pretend never existed. Buried beneath dust, tarp, and silence sat a machine so untouched, so perfect, it felt like a secret built from thunder. He checked the VIN number twice, then again, and realized the government had gone to great lengths to erase it entirely. Then a sealed envelope arrived, and signed in cold, warning him, return the car, or watch everything burn quietly into memory. But when he opened the trunk, what he found inside wasn't just forbidden. It was built to defy everything we're told is true. The blueprints were handwritten, the reel was sealed, and the final letter said only this: some truths drive faster than fear. Now the road is watching, the engine is breathing, and someone powerful is coming to bury what his grandfather died to protect. Tom, who only wanted to understand his grandfather, couldn't yet know that understanding meant stepping onto a forgotten blacklist. Langston, the engineer who once helped bury the truth, had no idea it would resurface wearing the face of Arlo's bloodline. The bureaucrat who stamped "No in retail" in 1968 certainly had no idea that decision would return to his desk 57 years later. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now let's begin. It all started with the steady rhythm of metal on metal, echoing across the quiet back roads of Westburg, a place so small that even the wind knew when to keep quiet. And the only thing louder than the silence was the hum of an engine turning over for the first time in a long while. Tom Davis grew up with that sound in his bones, the kind of sound that didn't just fill a room. It filled a life, carving a boy into a man with each twist of the wrench and each puff of exhaust hanging low in the morning air. The garage stood squat and stubborn just off the highway bend, like it had been there long before the road and wasn't in any hurry to leave. It was made of old cinder block and wisdom, with grease stains older than most folks in town and bolts scattered across the floor like forgotten prayers. Inside that garage worked Arlo Davis, Tom's grandfather, a man who spoke only when silence ran out of use, whose way with machines bordered on the sacred, as though engines trusted him more than they trusted their own blueprints. He never raised his voice, never rushed a job, never bragged about the things he could do with nothing but a crescent wrench, a flashlight, and a look that said, "Go ahead and doubt me." Arlo believed in three things: do the job right, leave things better than you found them, and never open the damn barn. Now, that barn sat just behind the garage, through a tangled mess of kudzu and rusted parts. Its roof caved slightly on one side, its wood black with age, and its big, cross-beam doors chained shut like something inside wanted out a long time ago, but had since given up trying. There were no locks on the house, no alarm system on the garage, but that barn had more security than Fort Knox, and all it took was Arlo saying, "Don't go in there," for everyone in town to nod and pretend they weren't curious. Sander, the old German shepherd with fur like peppered iron and eyes too wise for his own good, always curled up near the barn's edge, watching it like it might do something unexpected if no one paid attention. Tom, being just a kid back then, had the sense not to push his luck, but he often found himself drifting toward that fence, staring through the slats, wondering what made a man like Arlo, who feared nothing and fixed everything, bother to chain a building shut and never speak of it again. Evenings would come, golden and slow, and Tom would sit on a creaky lawn chair with a bottle of pop in one hand and questions in his heart that he didn't yet have the nerve to ask. The older he got, the more he learned about torque, timing, carburetors, and quiet dignity, and the more he realized that the garage wasn't just where Arlo worked, it was where Arlo was. And in that space, Tom learned the rhythm of a life lived with calloused hands and clean intentions, where every bolt had its purpose, and every sound told a story, if you knew how to listen. One winter afternoon, Tom, maybe 17 then, finally asked, not boldly, not foolishly, just soft enough to be heard but not challenged, as they stood under the hood of a beat-up Impala, snow threatening from the clouds above. "Grandpa," he said, wiping oil from his fingers, eyes locked on the barn like it had moved an inch closer since morning. "What's in there, really?" Arlo didn't look up. He just reached for the torque wrench, tightened a bolt, and said with a slow, worn-out breath. Not everything we build is made to be understood. Some things, son, some things you just protect. And that was the last word on the barn for years. Tom moved on, joined a factory crew in Lansing, watched the country change through the haze of early morning shifts and late-night TV. Called less, drove home even less. But the smell of oil and the sound of a ratchet still lived in the corners of his mind like echoes waiting for someone to answer. Then came the call. Arlo passed in his sleep. Stroke. Quiet. The kind of ending men like him deserve, but don't always get. Tom came home. The house hadn't changed. The gravel crunched the same under his boots. And when he walked into that garage, dust motes dancing in the same lazy beams of afternoon light, it was like no time had passed at all. Everything was in its place. Tools still hung where they always had. The radio still sat tuned to a static-filled AM station. And Sander, slower now, walked to him and laid his head against Tom's leg like he'd just been out for groceries. And that barn still stood behind the shop, wrapped in shadow and memory, waiting. Tom stared at it long after sunset, the chains glinting faintly in the moonlight, the boards groaning just enough to be heard. Finally, half to the night and half to the ghost of Arlo Davis, he asked, "But what could be so important you'd hide it even from me?" Sander, with a grunt in his throat and a slow shift in his old hips, turned his head toward Tom and answered the only way he could. He stood up, quiet, slow, deliberate, and padded down the gravel path, past the edge of the garage, through the weeds that brushed like whispers against his fur, and stopped dead center in front of that old barn door, letting out a sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't peace either. Tom followed, unsure if the moment was real or just nostalgia playing tricks, but something in Sander's stance made him pause, like the dog knew the barn had been waiting, and the waiting was finally over. The chain on the doors had rusted together like fused bones, and the padlock was so corroded that the numbers had long since vanished, leaving nothing behind but silence and resistance. Two things Arlo had always understood and never feared. Tom didn't move right away. He stood there with the wind brushing the back of his neck like fingers from the past, staring at the chained doors with a kind of reverence you reserve for graves and monuments, not knowing whether to knock or turn away. Inside his chest, his heart beat with a rhythm that didn't feel like his own, and he thought about that day years ago, the way Arlo had tightened that bolt and let his words hang like smoke in the cold. Some things you just protect. The next morning, before the town had even rolled out of bed, Tom took his time clearing the brush around the barn, his gloves soaked with dew and thorn scratches, until the shape of the door stood clear and unapologetic in the rising light. The angle grinder screamed to life like a ghost waking from slumber, and sparks rained down as he cut through the old chain, the air thick with the smell of burning metal and something older, something like anticipation. When the last link fell with a heavy clink, the door creaked open half an inch, not in welcome, but in protest, as if even the wood remembered Arlo's warning and wasn't so sure about letting go of whatever had been sealed inside. Tom hesitated, one hand on the rusted latch, the other on the doorframe, then pushed, slow, steady, and watched as the darkness inside gave way to shape and color, dust swirling like spirits startled from sleep. At first, there was only silence, that kind of silence that wraps around your ankles and climbs slowly, like deep water. Then he saw it. Under a torn canvas tarp, stretched tight over a shape too familiar to mistake, sat something no man forgets once he's seen it. A 1969 CAMARO SS, HUGER orange, its body gleaming even beneath decades of dust, as if it refused to surrender its pride. Tom didn't move for a full minute, not because he was afraid, but because awe has a way of freezing a man more than fear ever could, especially when what he's looking at shouldn't be there, not in a barn, not untouched, not after all this time. He reached out, slow as you please, and pulled back the tarp, the fabric stiff and brittle in his hands, revealing the chrome, the grille, the lines, the kind of car that didn't just drive, it announced. There were no license plates, no inspection stickers, not a single registration mark. It sat like a question wrapped in steel. Tom opened the driver's door and slid behind the wheel, half expecting the thing to crumble under his weight, but instead he found the interior almost pristine, oddly pristine, in fact. There was no radio. The dash was bare, matte black. The shift knob was short, custom, with suede inserts along the sides that didn't match any production model he could remember. And the engine, he popped the hood, was a 427 big block, not a 396 like it should have been, and everything from the headers to the valve covers looked untouched, but perfect, as if it had been built for speed and then buried under silence. That's when he saw it, barely visible under the grime on the firewall, a tiny strip of stamped steel, the vehicle identification number. He wiped it clean, squinting to make it out, then pulled out his phone to cross-check it. Nothing. No matches. No records. Not in public databases, not in collector archives, not even on the dark corners of CAMARO forums where the most obscure vents eventually surface. It wasn't that the car was rare. It was that, officially, it didn't exist. Tom leaned back against the side of the car, a low whistle slipping through his teeth, then looked down at Sander, who'd followed him in and now sat squarely in front of the CAMARO's grill like a soldier guarding the last flag. "Well, buddy," Tom said, scratching the dog behind the ears, "either Grandpa built her out of moonlight and scrap dreams, or somebody didn't want her name written down." Sander looked up, tail twitching once, then let out a soft huff, as if to say, "Keep looking, kid." And as Tom stood in the barn stillness, a new question came. He turned to the CAMARO, hand resting on its hood like he might wake it with a touch, and asked softly, "But why would someone build a car and make sure no one could ever find it?" Sitting on a rusted folding chair beneath a single dangling bulb, Tom heard the answer, not from the car, not from the barn, but from the voice of his own uncle, crackling through an old landline phone in the garage's back office. "Because," said Walt Davis, Arlo's younger brother, voice hoarse from too many years of welding and whiskey, "that car wasn't made for sale, or for street, or for show. It was made to disappear before anybody important found out it existed." The line went quiet for a moment, filled with that low hum only old phones make, the kind that carries more ghosts than sound, and Tom knew that Walt wasn't speaking from memory, but from a place he thought he'd buried long ago. "Your granddad," Walt continued, "wasn't just some grease monkey with a good ear for engines. Back in '68, he was what the company called a ghost hand, the kind of man they pulled in when something needed building that wasn't ever going to see a brochure." Tom sat back, the weight of his uncle's words settling in with the same slow heaviness that had crept through the barn the moment he'd opened it. "I looked up the VIN," Tom said. "It's not listed. Not anywhere." "That's the point, kid," Walt said with a chuckle, dry as sandpaper. "That's not a VIN. It's a silence. You found something they never planned to name." Tom stepped outside the barn as the sun slipped behind the hills, painting the sky with brushstrokes of orange and ash, and he tried to process what he now knew, that the CAMARO wasn't just rare or special, it was deliberately erased. Back inside the barn, he traced his fingers along the door panel, and for a moment, it felt like Arlo was there beside him, sleeves rolled up, jaw clenched, eyes watching for something more than just clean lines and polished chrome. And then came the strangest moment yet. Sliding the passenger seat forward to check for tools or a spare belt, Tom spotted something wedged between the seat bracket and the floor mat, a clear plastic envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with tape that cracked as he pulled it free. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded into thirds, bearing the faded header of the Midland plant, General Motors. In black block letters it read, "Unit 13, non-reg, test mule. Do not circulate. Supervisor, ML." There was no signature, no stamp, no other page. Just that phrase, "do not circulate." The term test mule wasn't new to Tom. He'd read enough gearhead forums to know it referred to prototype vehicles built for testing performance parts, usually under the skin of regular models, never meant for the public, and often destroyed once data was collected. But this CAMARO, it wasn't cobbled together. It was finished. It was whole. Every inch of it was deliberate, refined, and quietly furious. And there, in that same barn air thick with old hay and oil vapor, Tom remembered something else, something Arlo once said late one night after a storm had knocked out the power, and they sat by lantern light, sipping instant coffee. Arlo had looked toward the barn and said, almost absently, "Some machines were made wrong on purpose, so folks like us would know what right still looked like." At the time, Tom thought he was just talking about shoddy builds and cheap parts. Now, the meaning stretched wider than he could have imagined. He took a deep breath and looked around the barn, trying to make sense of it all, the hidden prototype, the erased number, the sealed note. And still, one question pressed harder than the rest, sitting heavy on his chest like a weight he hadn't earned. But why him? Why Arlo? Out of all the men in the world, why did they choose my grandfather to build it? The answer came not from a voice, but from the soft flutter of paper slipping loose from an old manila folder tucked between the pages of a thick Chilton repair manual, the kind Arlo always kept close for show, even if he never needed to open it. Tom had dropped the manual onto the garage bench while clearing out a shelf that hadn't been touched in a decade, and when it hit the surface, the folder spilled open, releasing a handful of black and white photographs, their edges curled, their backs labeled in Arlo's blocky handwriting. One photo stopped Tom cold. There, standing beside what looked like a stripped-down Chevrolet prototype, was Arlo, 40 years younger, leaner, with a cigarette in his mouth and grease up to his elbows, but unmistakably him, eyes sharp beneath a ball cap pulled low. But what made Tom's breath catch wasn't just seeing his grandfather looking so alive. It was the man standing next to him. Tall, thin, dressed not like a factory hand, but like a man used to writing checks with other people's money. This stranger wore a collared shirt and slacks far too clean for a place like Midland. His hand rested on Arlo's shoulder, not as a friend, not as a boss, but as someone who needed what Arlo knew, someone who trusted him to build what others couldn't even imagine. On the back of the photo, the caption read, Midland, June 68, AD plus ML. And there it was again, ML, the same initials from the plastic-wrapped note under the Camaro's seat. Tom sat down slowly, the picture in his lap, his fingers tracing the grainy outlines of a story that no one had ever told, a chapter in his family's life that had somehow been sealed shut behind chains and silence. He searched the garage for anything else marked ML, notes, parts receipts, blueprints. But it wasn't until he opened the bottom drawer of Arlo's old desk that he found something that didn't belong. A small, leather-bound address book, the kind people stopped using once phones got smart. Near the back, in faded pencil, a name was scribbled beside a P.O. box in Ohio. Martin Langston, GM Engineering, retired. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, Tom wrote a short letter, just a few lines asking if the man remembered Arlo Davis, and if so, why he might have built something meant never to be driven. He mailed it without much hope, thinking maybe, if he was lucky, he'd get a note from a widow or a son saying Mr. Langston had passed on, taking whatever secrets he had with him. But 4 days later, an envelope arrived. No return address, just a single line on the back. Yes, call me. And a number. Tom waited until evening, when the sun sat low behind the trees and the shadows stretched long across the garage floor, before dialing. The voice on the other end was slow, quiet, and so old it sounded like it had spent most of the past decade whispering only to itself. Mr. Davis, it said, if you're Arlo's grandson, I owe you some truth. Tom leaned forward in his chair, the air around him suddenly colder than it had been a minute ago, as if the voice had opened a window to a different decade. Your grandfather, Langston began, wasn't chosen. He volunteered. Tom blinked. Volunteered for what? Langston sighed, the sound heavy like a door swinging shut. To keep something from becoming a lie. There was silence between them, heavy and full. Then Langston spoke again, slower this time. We built 13 units back in '68. Only one was finished. Only one had a soul. And then he said it, as if it were just a memory, but Tom could feel the gravity in the words pulling history into shape. Your grandfather knew they'd bury it. He built it anyway. Tom stared at the Camaro through the barn window, watching the way the last light of day traced the line of its fender like a hand over a sleeping lion. And in that quiet moment, one question rose above the rest. What exactly was this project, Mr. Langston? What were you trying to prove? The old man's voice hesitated. Just a second, just a breath. But in that hesitation, Tom felt the weight of things buried for decades, the kind of truth too dense to float and too dangerous to speak out loud unless a man was sure the wind was listening. We weren't trying to prove anything, Langston finally said, his voice a dry rasp full of unslept nights and half-told regrets. We were trying to remember what it meant. Tom didn't speak. He let the silence sit, let the man find his rhythm. Back then, Langston continued, they were chasing economy, chasing safety, chasing volume. Muscle was dying, too loud, too crude, too wild for a world that was already starting to count miles per gallon like they used to count war bonds. Tom could picture it. Long hallways with linoleum floors, executives in narrow ties holding meetings in smoke-filled rooms, weighing passion against profit until nothing good stood a chance. But someone, Someone higher than me asked a different question, Langston said, voice dipping to a whisper. They wanted to know, what's the fastest, most responsive, most mechanically honest car we can build if we stop caring who buys it? Tom felt that hit somewhere below the ribs. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was exactly the kind of thing Arlo would say. And your grandfather, Langston went on, was the only man we knew who could build something like that without writing a single line of it down. He didn't need a CD program or a committee. He just needed time and steel. Tom looked out the garage window, eyes falling again on the CAMARO, still resting in the shadows of the barn, still silent, still waiting. So why hide it? He asked. Why finish it and then bury it? Langston didn't answer that question. Not yet. Instead, he gave Tom one last name, one last thread to pull. You want the whole story, he said. Find Ray Cochran. Nevada Test Range. He was there when your grandfather turned the key. And with that, the line went dead. Tom didn't call back. Didn't write. Didn't ask anything more of Langston. Some men only get one chance to speak a truth that sat too long inside. And if you press, it turns back into silence. So, Tom turned his attention back to the car, not as a mystery, but as a machine. And if there was one thing his grandfather taught him, it was this. You don't force a machine to life, you invite it. For the next 2 weeks, he did what Arlo would have done. No shortcuts. No guesswork. Just one careful step at a time. Fuel lines were replaced, brittle and bone-dry from years of stillness. Carb jets were cleaned by hand, each one soaked and scrubbed until they shone like gold teeth. Spark plugs were swapped, old belts were changed, fluids drained and refilled. Every morning, Tom walked to the garage, rolled up his sleeves, and greeted the car like an old friend who hadn't spoken in years but still knew the sound of your voice. And every night, Sanders sat by the door, patient, loyal, like he'd seen this before and was just waiting for the final note in a song left unfinished. By the 13th morning, something poetic about that number, he thought. The CAMARO was ready. It was early. The town was still asleep. No traffic, no birds. Just him, Sander, and a stillness thick as wet cotton. Tom slid behind the wheel, hand on the key, heart tapping a rhythm somewhere between fear and reverence. He took a long breath and turned the ignition. What came next wasn't noise. It wasn't even power. It was presence. The engine came alive with a low, primal growl, deep and steady, like a bear waking in the dark, echoing off the barn walls and into his bones. The whole car shook slightly, not from imbalance, but from memory, like it recognized itself again after being forgotten too long. Sander barked, once, sharp, then sat down like he'd done his job. Tom eased the throttle, and the beast responded with something almost like gratitude, the way a man nods after hearing a song that saved his life. And in that moment, there wasn't a single question in his mind. Until he killed the engine, stepped out, and found an envelope taped to the barn door, sealed tight, still dry despite the morning dew. No return address. No stamps. Just 4 words written in clean block print. Return to Unit 13. And below that, a warning. It was never meant to leave. Tom turned the envelope in his hands, looked out toward the road, and asked softly to no one in particular. Who else knows about this car? The answer came not from a voice on the phone or a letter in the mail, but from the sharp chime of the garage landline, one of those old rotary phones Arlo never let go of. Its ring so loud and sudden it felt like it had torn open time itself. Tom wiped his hands on a rag, his heart still drumming from the CAMARO's roar that morning, and picked up the receiver slowly, like it might bite. There was no greeting, no introduction, just the dry rasp of a voice hardened by desert wind and long memory. I was told you brought her back, the voice said. That true? Tom glanced toward the barn, where the CAMARO now sat covered once more, this time not for hiding, but for respect. Yeah, he said quietly. She runs. The voice paused, maybe surprised by the calm, maybe just thinking about how long it had been since those words had any meaning. Your grandfather ever mention a man named Cochran? The caller asked. Tom's breath caught. He'd heard that name once before, just days earlier, Ray Cochran. The man Langston said was there when the key turned for the first time. He mentioned you without mentioning you, Tom said. Are you him? I am, the voice replied, and even though it came through wires and static, it carried something sharp beneath it, something unfinished. Cochran gave an address, no explanation, no persuasion, just a place in Nevada, near a decommissioned test range, miles off any road a tourist would ever find. He said, if you're gonna do this, you better see where she was born. Tom didn't ask what this was. He already knew. 2 days later, The Camaro rolled down an empty stretch of Nevada asphalt under a sky so wide it felt like a lie, the kind of road that wasn't on any map, cracked by time and silence, and built for speed, not traffic. Every now and then, he'd glance in the mirror, not looking for cars, but for ghosts. Because in a car like that, it wasn't the miles behind you that mattered, it was the weight of the people who once sat in your seat. He arrived just before dusk. The facility had long since been gutted, chain-link fences torn by time, hangars hollowed out by weather and memory, but a single trailer still stood at the edge of the compound, and on its porch sat a man who looked like he hadn't stood in a while. Ray Cochran was lean the way steel rebar is lean, all wire and tension, skin leathered by years of unforgiving sun and secrets no one was supposed to keep this long. He didn't stand when Tom parked. He just nodded once, slow and knowing, like a man seeing the last page of a book he'd read 100 times. "She still has that cold start growl?" he asked. Tom chuckled softly. "Yeah. Woke up the whole barn." Ray nodded again. "That's how we knew she was the one." Even the dyno guys flinched. Tom walked up the porch steps, pulled up a lawn chair, and for a while, neither man said much. The wind did most of the talking, rustling dry weeds and stirring up old dust in the dying light. Finally, Tom asked, "You were there when it was built?" Cochran's answer came with a slow shake of the head. "No, kid. I was there when it was almost unbuilt." He reached into a small lockbox and pulled out a photograph, one that looked a lot like the one Tom had found earlier. But in this one, the Camaro was on the track, surrounded by men in suits, none of them smiling. "They built her to see what the body could take," Ray said, pointing to the blurred image of the car rounding a curve. "Not the frame. Not the tires. The man." Tom looked closer and noticed something strange. There were no roll bars, no safety harness, not even a helmet in the shot. "They wanted to know how far a man would go," Ray said. "How fast he'd dare push something that wasn't supposed to exist." "And my grandfather?" Tom asked. "What was he doing there?" Ray leaned back and lit a cigarette with fingers that trembled just slightly. He wasn't supposed to drive it. But when their test guy bailed, Arlo stepped in. Said he wouldn't let them tear apart something they hadn't earned. Tom felt that settle deep in his chest. "You see," Ray continued, "Arlo didn't build that car to prove something about the company or the country. He built it because he believed something good, something pure shouldn't have to apologize for being fast or loud or beautiful." Tom sat with that a while. The idea that his grandfather had not just saved the car, but stood between it and whatever it was meant to become. Then Ray looked him dead in the eye, voice low and final. "But now that she's running again, they'll come looking. And when they come, they won't be asking." Tom looked down at the photograph, then back at the Camaro parked near the fence, orange paint catching the last light of day. And he asked, not with panic, but with purpose, "What exactly are they afraid of?" Ray Cochran didn't answer right away. He just looked out across the flat Nevada plain, where the sun had burned the horizon down to embers and the wind felt like it carried voices from places too far gone to return. "They're afraid," he finally said, voice rough but steady, "of what it reminds people they once believed in." Tom sat there, letting those words fall heavy, because they didn't sound like some old man's paranoia or the half-mad poetry of someone stuck in the past. No, they sounded like a simple truth, uncomfortable, unspoken, and carved into the bones of every machine that was ever built to go fast for no good reason except the thrill of knowing it could. "They'll call it a liability," Ray continued, motioning toward the Camaro with the tip of his cigarette. "They'll say it's dangerous, outdated, unregulated, but what they really mean is it wasn't authorized. And deep down, that car makes people feel something they can't measure or sell." Tom didn't reply, but the silence between them shifted, became denser, fuller, like the past had pulled up a chair and was now listening in. That night, Tom slept in the Camaro, parked beneath the stars just outside the fence line, with Sander curled in the back seat and a rusted pistol tucked under the floor mat. Just in case paranoia decided to be practical. And around 3 in the morning, something woke him. Not a sound, not a light, a feeling, like a whisper through steel. He reached for the glove box, maybe thinking of the note he'd found before, or maybe just following some old instinct passed down through oil-stained generations. But instead of the flashlight he kept there, his hand brushed against something off. He pulled it out, a square of thin aluminum, cold to the touch despite the heat still trapped in the car. At first glance, it looked like a fuse panel, but beneath the dust and grime was a faint engraving, barely visible, but unmistakable once the light hit just right. AD 13. Not a part number. Not a model. A mark. He followed the hunch, lifted the back seat, peeled away the lining, ran his fingers along the inside edge of the chassis until they struck something solid and hollow, hidden behind what looked like factory welds, but with an irregular seam that didn't match the rest. He used a flathead screwdriver to pry the edge loose, slow and careful. What came free wasn't just a panel, it was a door. Behind it, bolted directly into the frame, was a small metal case. Heavy, locked, industrial. The kind of thing designed to survive wrecks, or worse. On the lid were two characters, stamped deep and without ceremony. 13X. Tom carried it back into Ray's trailer just as dawn began spilling gold across the desert floor. Ray looked at it and froze, not with fear, but with recognition, the kind that goes all the way down and doesn't come back up unchanged. You weren't supposed to find that, Ray whispered. Not unless everything else failed. Tom set it down gently. What is it? Ray didn't answer. He reached for the side drawer of his desk and pulled out a small key, dusty, worn, and tied to a tag that read only, a D, field lock. The lock clicked open with a mechanical snap that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Inside the case, wrapped in protective waxed paper and tucked between rubber bumpers, was a single document, aged, crisp-edged, stamped with the GM crest, and dated March 7, 1968. Ray unfolded it slowly, as if afraid it might dissolve from exposure to light. The heading read, Project 13X, Internal Memorandum, Midland Facility. Supervisor, A.D., Contract Fabricator, Provisional Clearance. Tom read every word, his heart sinking with each line, because this wasn't just a test build. It wasn't even just a prototype. It was a challenge. Engine configuration, 427 CI, modified intake. Interior spec, lighten/minimalist, no media hardware. Primary objective, track survivable high-speed human interface vehicle, non-media, non-retail. Status, 1-1, unit only, do not duplicate. Purpose, baseline truth retention, for internal use only. Final directive, erase trace post-completion, return to site, store, monitor. Tom couldn't breathe for a moment. Baseline truth, he asked. Ray nodded slowly. It was never supposed to win. It was supposed to remain. To show us what wasn't poisoned by compromise. Tom closed his eyes, feeling the whole world tilt slightly under his boots. He now understood. Arlo hadn't hidden the car because he feared what it was. He hid it because he respected what it still dared to be. And when Tom opened his eyes again, his voice came out quieter than before, but steadier. So who gave him permission to keep it? Ray Cochran didn't answer right away, and maybe that was the answer in itself. The kind of pause that isn't hesitation, but reverence, the kind you leave when you're about to speak someone's name for the first time in a long time. No one gave him permission, Ray finally said, voice flat and sure, like he wasn't offering an opinion, just reciting a fact written in the bones of the past. He just never asked for forgiveness. Tom sat back, the metal case still open beside him, the old memorandum folded and returned to its wax paper cocoon, as if even handling it too long might wake something better left asleep. It made sense now. Arlo wasn't waiting on a green light. He wasn't following some invisible chain of command or holding out for orders from a suit 3 states away. He'd seen the truth in that car, felt it under his skin, in his breath, in the trembling quiet that comes right before ignition, and he had decided, without announcement or apology, that it was worth saving. They sat like that until the sky turned slate gray and the Nevada heat gave way to desert chill. Tom left the next morning. Didn't say goodbye. Just shook Ray's hand, nodded once, and promised not to let them take her. He didn't know who they were. Not exactly, but he knew they were coming. Not with sirens or spotlights, but with letters and forms and words like liability and compliance. Back in Westburg, the garage felt different. Not haunted. Not dangerous. Just charged, like it was holding its breath. 3 days passed with no word. Then came the envelope. It was waiting on the workbench when Tom came in one morning, sitting there like it had always been part of the scenery, though he was sure it hadn't been there the night before. No name. No return address. No stamp. Just a thick cream envelope sealed with red wax. No emblem, no initials, just one deep crease through the center, like it had been folded into a jacket pocket and carried across time. Inside was a single sheet of paper, ivory, heavy stock, and typed with the kind of machine they don't make anymore. To the current holder of Vehicle Unit 13. The enclosed designation is not to be displayed, sold, or modified in any public domain. This vehicle is classified as non-retail and non-media. No authorization for public use was ever granted. If this unit remains in your possession, know that its continued existence is conditional. It must not enter circulation. It must not be disclosed to media or collector outlets. It must not be used for commerce or exhibition. Return to storage directive, active. Violation of this classification may result in federal intervention. No further communication will follow. Postal Drop 19, Ohio. Tom held the letter with gloved hands, not from fear, but out of a strange sense of duty, like the page itself had been handled by men who still smoked inside conference rooms and said things like national interest while staring out rain-covered windows. He folded the paper slowly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the top drawer of Arlo's desk, beneath the old service manuals and the last oil change log his grandfather had written by hand. Then he walked to the barn. The CAMARO was waiting clean now, detailed inside and out, the HUGER orange deep and steady like it had soaked in every sunset for the last 30 years. He ran his hand across the hood, felt the pulse beneath the paint, and whispered low enough that even Sander didn't lift his head. They still think they can bury you. And then, something shifted. A soft click from behind the dashboard, barely audible over the settling groan of the barn roof. Tom leaned in, flicked on the dome light, and saw it, an edge of paper, yellowed and thin, poking out from behind the fuse panel, where no paper had any business being. He pulled it free, careful, patient. It was another note, handwritten this time. The letters uneven, unmistakably Arlo's. Tom, if you found this, they came looking. You don't need to run. Just tell the truth before they erase it again. There's more under the trunk liner. But if you open it, you better be ready to carry it. Hey. Tom stood there a long while, hand resting on the panel, heart like a hammer in a quiet workshop. He didn't need to ask what was next. But he did anyway. Grandpa, he whispered, what did you hide in there that scared them more than it ever scared you? The answer lay waiting under metal and time, and Tom knew, standing there in that silent barn with the smell of dust and old gas curling in the air, that once he crossed this line, there'd be no way to pretend the world was ever simple again. He opened the trunk. Slowly, with both hands, like he was lifting the lid of something not meant to be disturbed, not because it was dangerous, but because it had been earned. The liner peeled back stiff, like parchment gone brittle, and beneath it was a recessed panel bolted flush into the floor, a hatch, custom-fitted and unmarked, the kind of thing no assembly line would bother hiding unless it held something more permanent than cargo. He reached for the socket wrench already waiting on the workbench, Arlo's wrench, the one with the smooth-worn grip and initials scratched in the shaft, and began undoing the bolts, one at a time, counting each turn like a prayer passed down through grease and silence. With the last bolt loose, the panel groaned slightly, then lifted with a soft pop of released tension. Beneath it was a steel case. Not aluminum. Not plastic. Steel. Welded edges. Recessed latches. A weight that spoke of intention, not accident. Stamped into the face of the case, beneath a layer of fine powder rust, were 3 characters. 13X. Not printed. Not etched. Punched. And beneath that, in a smaller font, something stranger still. Retainer copy. Do not transfer. Supervisory only. Tom swallowed. He didn't know why. Just knew that something old and true was about to shift its shape in his hands. The latches resisted, then gave way. Inside the case were 3 items. First, a sealed manila envelope, thick with documents. Handwriting scrawled across the front in Arlo's unmistakable block letter style reads simply, for Tom, if they come back. Second, a reel of 16 millimeters film, brittle and coiled tight, housed in a black metal canister labeled Midland Test Track / Project 13X, do not duplicate. And third, this one took Tom's breath away, a set of laminated blueprints, hand-drawn and remarkably detailed, bearing the official stamp of the Midland Engineering Department. But what struck him wasn't the technical data, it was the signature in the corner. Arlo Davis, lead fabricator / final supervisor, Unit 13 only. Tom stared at it, the ink faded but stubborn, like it had fought against the years and refused to be forgotten. This was no favor. No sideline gig. Arlo hadn't just helped. He had led the build. But it was what came next that turned Tom's breath cold and still. At the bottom of the blueprint, boxed off from the technical schematics and noted in red ink, were 4 lines typed on a separate slip taped neatly to the margin. Unit 13 is not for production or replication. Its purpose is philosophical, not commercial. Final design intends to challenge regulatory dilution by preserving a complete mechanical expression of man-machine interface. Status must remain off-record to avoid precedent. Tom sat down, the paper shaking slightly in his hands. This wasn't just a car. It was a message, a mechanical protest, sealed in steel, forged at the edge of history where soul and industry had once stood face to face, and one man had decided he wouldn't let the soul be buried quietly. Tom opened the envelope next, and inside were pages of Arlo's own handwriting, notes, reflections, even a short letter addressed to the next Davis with oil in his blood and stubborn in his bones. The letter was short, but it cut deep. Tom, they're going to want her back. Not because they need her, but because they need to pretend she never was. You don't need to fight them. Just make sure she stays seen. That's all the fight she ever needed. There's truth in her gears. Let her speak for herself. And if they come again, tell them I still remember what it means to build something that don't ask permission to be right. Arlo. Tom folded the letter slowly, slid it back into the envelope, and sat there in the trunk of the CAMARO, the cool metal beneath him grounding something too big to name. He could still hear his grandfather's voice. Not the words, but the rhythm, the way Arlo used to pause before saying something that mattered, just long enough to make sure the moment knew it was sacred. And then, quietly, from the back of the garage, Sander let out a low growl, not warning, not fear. Recognition. Tom stood, walked toward the side window, and looked out across the gravel lot just as the sun began to fade. A black sedan had pulled up by the edge of the property. Windows tinted. Engine idling. No movement. Tom didn't reach for the phone. He didn't run. He opened the barn door, stepped out into the evening, and asked the only question that mattered now. What do you people want with a car that doesn't belong to anyone but the truth? The man who stepped out of the black sedan wore no badge, no name tag, no visible authority, but he carried himself like someone who'd spent a lifetime behind doors that required clearance to open and silence to enter. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the barn, at the worn gravel drive, at Sander lying near the porch like an old sentry who still knew when to watch closely. Then he looked at Tom, not with threat, not even with judgment, but with the kind of weariness that comes from trying to explain gravity to a man standing on a cliff. That car, the man finally said, his voice calm and cold like steel left out under winter's sun, represents a promise that was never authorized and a memory we no longer allow ourselves to have. Tom didn't flinch. He stood still, arms crossed, feeling the old wind stir again through the cottonwoods behind the garage, the same wind that had rustled Arlo's overalls all those years ago when Tom was just a boy watching him fix a transmission without once raising his voice. She was never for sale, Tom said softly. She was never yours to take back. The man gave a slow nod, less agreement than acknowledgement. We're not here to seize her. We're here to make sure she doesn't start speaking again. Tom glanced back at the CAMARO, its profile glowing faintly in the barn light like an old lion finally waking from sleep, ready to stretch and remember its own roar. That car was built to remind people what we lost, Tom said. And I think you're afraid she still can. The man said nothing. Instead, he reached into his coat and handed Tom a sealed document, marked with nothing but a number, redacted, 13X. You're not under arrest. You're not under investigation, the man said. But know this, if she leaves this barn again, the road she takes won't be quiet. And neither will we. He turned, walked back to the sedan, and left as silently as he had arrived. Tom watched the taillights disappear beyond the trees, then stood a long while beneath the stars, not thinking, not planning, just listening to the silence Arlo had once worked inside, and knowing now that silence was not emptiness. It was protection. The next morning, Sunday dawned slow and golden, stretching across the fields with the kind of peace that makes men remember things they never wrote down. Tom rolled open the barn doors. The CAMARO, Unit 13, sat waiting, alive in stillness, not begging to run, but willing, like it knew this wasn't a joyride or a stunt. It was a eulogy. He started her up. The sound wasn't just an engine turning over, it was the voice of a generation that had once believed speed was not sin, and craftsmanship was not optional, and truth, even mechanical truth, had a right to be heard without permission. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just drove. Past the cornfields where scarecrows still stood with arms out like men ready for takeoff. Past the two-pump gas station where his grandfather once bought kerosene and conversation in equal measure. Past the last strip of asphalt before the hills rose to meet the sky. And when the road turned to dirt, he kept going. on an old overlook above the valley, where telephone poles leaned like tired sentinels and wind had worn the railing smooth, and he found it. A carving, faint but sure, scratched into the wood by a steady hand over 50 years ago. Arlo Davis was here. 1971. Tom reached out, placed his hand over the letters, and felt them pulse not in wood, but in blood. The car behind him clicked softly, metal contracting in the morning sun. Sanders stepped forward and laid his head on Tom's leg. Tom smiled, quiet and complete. He turned back toward the CAMARO, walked slowly to the hood, and placed his palm on the warm paint, felt the hum still there, like a heartbeat that never doubted itself, only waited for someone to listen. "Yeah," he whispered, voice breaking just enough to matter. "I understand now. Thank you." And for a long moment, everything stood still, not as an end, but as a beginning finally remembered. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.